So this video, what is it? It's kind of just two nerds talking. So this video is a video between myself and my friend Ben Krueger. Ben Krueger is an audio engineer just like me, and we're basically just talking about, when to go into the studio, how you can save money, how you can do certain things at home and then save certain things for the studio, stuff like that. So I hope you like the conversation. I'm going to have links in the description to Ben's YouTube channel and his website probably. I'll have a few links for Ben basically. And just know that this conversation is a two-part conversation. So the first half of the conversation is on Ben's channel. So if you want to watch the whole conversation in order, I would go check out the video that's on Ben's channel first. And that, again, will be in the description below. And other than that, I hope you like it. Thanks.
All right, so we've talked about the positives and the negatives of the studio, and now we want to talk about the positives and negatives of recording at home.
Yeah.
So we'll start with the positives. There's a lot of positives for artists recording at home these days. The first one we put is ease and time.
Yeah.
So it's easy in a way, and time is only as limited as the time you have on this earth, right?
Yeah.
So,
and it's convenient, it's like you can get home from work and do a few takes and see how that goes, and so you can slowly build it over time.
Yeah.
As you have the time, which is good. It's good because everyone's busy nowadays.
Right.
But
and back to the planning. I mean, to have, if nothing else, a fully fledged out demo before you go into the studio. So even if you aren't interested in recording techniques and investing money in microphones and preamps and those kind of things, if you have a demo that's just done on one, the mic you use on stage, SM58 or 57, and you record your parts and you bring that into the studio, you'll at least have the map and save yourself that time and have those creative decisions made. Save you a lot of time. Yeah, exactly. So I think that if nothing else, having a small, simple setup at home, which it seems like most or a lot of people
are getting that now.
Yeah. So it's worthwhile.
Yeah. You get like a little interface and a mic, and it doesn't have to be fancy. And then, it's like essentially then you don't have to spend the time making scratch tracks in the studio, right? It's like you've made your own scratch tracks.
Right.
And then you'll replace them potentially. Not always, but you'll replace them. But that's, it's still saving you that groundwork.
Yeah. Yeah. And I find for me, when I am recording people in the studio, like I want to know this as much as I can ahead. Like I often ask people about their tempos,
Yeah.
And if they don't want to, that's something that people don't really always recognize, but it's such an important thing because especially if you're recording organic instruments and stuff, you go in and if someone's like, oh, it's too slow, but you've recorded acoustic guitar, cello, and like drums, you're no. Me speeding this up like 3 beats is going to be a lot, there's a lot of artifacts. It's just a harder thing to do.
Go bad.
It's not ideal. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
So it's either going to cost time or it's going to, cost re-recording those. So having those decisions made, having the feel in a way you want, I think is really important to save money at the studio and costs. So.
Yeah, I think so, for sure.
And like you said, just the ease and time of like being able to do it on your own time and maybe do 100 takes or just do it for 30 minutes after work or whatever it may be that makes it easy and accessible to you. It's really nice.
And I feel like then sometimes people are more comfortable to make bigger swings emotionally with their performance or what have you. So you might get a different performance out of it than otherwise.
Right.
So, I mean, that would be more for if you're actually recording at home and then using that in the final thing. But that's another thing to consider.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, I've also had stuff that I thought was going to just remain on the demo and it ends up in the final track, especially, have all the tempo and stuff matched and you just have a guitar performance that I did on like the Logic guitar or something and just plugged in and it's like that ends up getting used in the final because it's just becomes a part of the song that feels like it's part of it, you can mix other things around it but I have stuff that surprised me.
Yeah, it does. Like sometimes that happens. And I think a lot of nowadays it's like there are a lot of professional musicians that are collaborating by doing that kind of process, right? Where you're recording the thing at home and maybe it's not like a perfect recording, but then, you're sending it to someone else and, they're adding something and then, I've worked on tracks where it's like, we'll hire a drummer to record a drum line, whatever. Part.
Drum track.
For it. And it's like, I listen to it and I'll be like, okay, this is not how I would have recorded it. It's not like ideal in my world, but like I can work with it. I'll like add my effects and stuff and mix it, and it's like it ends up better than you might think.
Right.
So it's like that's a totally feasible way to work
Yeah.
and get stuff put together, and then it's it's like so much more affordable to, if you want like a session musician or someone to come in on your piece, to have them just do that remotely and then send it in sometimes than it is to have them, schedule time in a big studio and then go in and do the whole thing. So.
Right. Because really, if I had to boil it, if you had to ask like, what's the one thing that would save you money at the studio, it's like it's being prepared.
Yeah.
It's like having your song, know, planned out and written as much as you want to. Like, you know, you may be improvising a solo or something, but if you have the structure of the song and the feel and the tempo of the song the way you want, that's really ultimately going to...
You've like finalized the lyrics.
Exactly.
Yeah, all that stuff.
Yeah.
And even just figuring out ahead of time, what you want to sound like, so you can then articulate that to the engineer, either ahead of time or, at the time or whatever. But
And our second point of that, like our outline, was like also the same, which was getting the take you want, like unrushed. So it's very similar to what we're talking about. It's just like having that time and space if you want to flesh things out and experiment with things and not feel like there's any pressure to like have it be the way you want. Right. Like you can just kind of be in some ways more like audacious or out there or something with your, parts and just try things, and you don't have as much pressure financially or time-wise for it to work.
Right.
Right. So.
Yeah. And there's a lot people can do nowadays with that kind of a recording. So.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so our third one is also very obvious, which was saving money. We've talked about that. It's being able to take that time at home obviously saves you money in the long run. There's kind of, I think if you're buying like a simple, entry-level interface and a microphone, that certainly saves you time and money. I think for someone that's really wanting to get good recording at home, then it starts to be, are you interested in learning that? Are you interested in investing in a good microphone, in a preamp, an acoustic treatment, or at least
you can just
a
keep
vocal
going.
booth or something, right? You just can keep going, and then you're on the path that you and I are on, which is building out your
it's never ending.
home studio into something else. So so
there's something to be said for like division of labor, right? You have someone that's specialized in that, and then you focus on your thing type of thing. There's something to be said for that.
I really feel like so much of it is interest, right? Because you could just spend as much money investing in all this stuff, but I know for me, I'm so interested in it. So me only going to the studio would just be cutting myself off from something I'm very interested and passionate about and want to learn about and want to experiment with and have access to more often. And so for me, the interest really drives it,
Yeah. And I think if someone's not interested in it, then they're probably not going to invest the time in figuring it out enough to even remotely start to catch up to someone that is. So it's like, if you're not into it, then I'd say like just get a simple interface and a mic and
right, and spend your money
do that
in the studio,
and then focus on your performance with your time.
Exactly. Yeah, because it'll be cheaper in the long run, even if you spend little bursts of money when you're in the studio.
So, but if you're into it, go wild. It's fun. I'm into it. So.
That's why we're here today, right? All right, so we've talked a ton about the positives of the recording at home. There's some negatives about recording at home as well. So we have a couple that we were going to outline. And so one of those is what we were just talking about. You may not have the skill set.
Yeah, you might not know how to get what you want. And that can be frustrating.
Right.
That can be really frustrating.
Yeah.
And I've seen other things too, like not just with, being able to get a good recording, but like I've seen, for example, people send in MIDI files remotely to be used on a song, and they didn't set the tempo first. So then, like, the metadata had the wrong tempo, and you import it, and so like you have to re-export it basically. That's the solution we did in that case. At least there are probably other solutions too, but like, it's so things come up that you may not realize.
Right. And if you, even if you were to buy, let's just say a U87, right, like a $3,000, $3,500 mic, and you don't know what you're doing, and you take that $3,500 mic home, and you're in an untreated room, and you are clipping because you don't know that, like, how to set your levels, or you have it super quiet where you're gonna have a noise floor problem later. Like it's that $3,000 plus mic all of a sudden doesn't become as valuable as someone that knows what they're doing with a $200 mic, right? So it's really like there is a whole thing about experience with getting the best sound.
It's kind of like the idea of a good photographer can get a good photo with like a Polaroid camera.
Exactly.
Versus, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like the gear helps, of course.
Yeah.
But it's not the only. It's matching
Yeah.
the skill set of the person using it. Exactly. Yeah.
It's like I think about like microphones as it's like choosing your paintbrush, right? So it's like it's just a tool. So.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and our second point was about that same thing. It's like you may not have quality gear.
Yeah.
So even if you do know what you're doing, but you don't want to invest or you don't have the opportunity at the time to invest in buying a nice preamp and a microphone, it may be cheaper because you want to record an EP, you've got everything planned out. It may just be cheaper to go to the studio and do that with all the gear that they've already invested in, and that's one of the beauties of the studio. So
yeah, I think part of that, it's like there's the math you do in your head, right? And it's like, what kind of gear do I want to use, right? And if that's fancy enough, if that's expensive enough, then guess what? It's going to be cheaper to go to the studio.
Right.
Yeah.
And you may not be a gear person at all, and that brings us back to either consulting with someone about getting a chain for the thing that you do that you can replicate and use easily, or outsourcing it to someone else that has invested that time and has that interest, right? So and
it's like music's collaborative, and people seem to I don't want to say people seem to forget that, but there's like people realize that with like bands and like, oh, it's a collaborative thing. Like it's going to be me and a bassist, like the whole thing.
Right.
And then that extends to also the production side, right?
Yeah.
Like it's fun to have someone to collaborate with.
Right.
It's like it becomes this big thing that I wouldn't have become if it was just you.
Right.
And
I
like.
Yeah, and there's a thing about like people, the adage about 10,000 hours makes you expert, right? Like, so it's like where you want to spend your time. Like life is finite, right? So if you're really not into audio engineering mixing, like spending 10,000 hours just to get a good track does not really feel worth it to me, versus like working with someone who can understand your music and is excited about that aspect of it. And again, like you might spend the money at that moment, but over time, you're going to be able to do the things you love, play more guitar, play more piano, sing, rehearse with your band, anything else that music aspect, book live shows, and whatever it is, that's where your attention is more than just that other process, right?
It's like, what do you want to specialize in? Yeah. And you don't get the time back. So
right.
There's something to be said for being well-rounded too.
Yeah.
Not to contradict it, but like, it's like, what do you want to specialize in? How do you want to spend your time? And,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the third point we had, which I actually think is a really important one, was everything is always like a positive and a negative, right? And so the third basically negative we said about recording at home is there is a lack of urgency or inspiration or motivation, possibly. Like when you go to a studio, maybe you've booked one day and you're like, I'm going to do this, or you booked a week, or you have 5 sessions, or who knows what. But like when you're at home, it can just seem like, oh, I'll work on that tomorrow. I'm going to watch The Bachelorette or something, and just like you don't end up getting it done because it's too familiar in a way, right?
Yeah. And it makes me think about those apps where it's like you get paid if you go to the gym, because so many everyone puts $5 in, and it's whoever ends up doing it gets the pot type of thing.
Interesting.
And it's like there's this disincentive. There's the incentives in place when you're going to the studio. You're investing money, and you're going to lose that money if you don't show up the day of.
Yeah, right.
Or lose part of it.
Something's going to happen.
So like that's and then there's also the social pressure to show up and not be a jerk and
right.
So that helps, and then having someone there to be like, we're focusing on this thing, we're doing this thing, we're not getting distracted, we're going to do this thing. That helps, I think, too.
Yeah, you're there, you have a plan, everything's set up, so the stage is set. So in a way that's a negative of the studio and positive. But again, it's a balance, right? Like we've been talking about. It's not just like a formula. Everything's going to have to play into everyone's kind of mindset. But it can be demotivating to work at home if your space, or maybe it's in your bedroom, but
hard to get in the flow.
Yeah, hard to get the flow. So it just kind of depends on the space and the person, but that is a potential negative.
Well, I think like a lot of us kind of figured out a lot about that in recent years, with like all the pandemic work from home. Exactly, so it's like, are you the type of person that does well at working from home and like stays focused, or do you prefer to go into the office or
Right.
have like meetings that push you along or whatever,
Right.
you know?
Yeah. All right. So we've talked a lot about pros and cons of the studio and home, and we want to talk just a little bit logistics, like what kind of tracks, what are the like nuts and bolts, things that we would recommend people do at home versus the studio, and why might they do that? So the first thing is we said, or like in terms of things that we encourage people or would suggest that people do from home as like a suggestion. One of the first things you said was MIDI.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
kind of a low-hanging fruit, right? But why do you think MIDI is good at home?
Yeah, I mean, it might be kind of obvious to some people, but, you know, it's the idea that you don't need a good acoustic space. You don't need a really expensive microphone, you know, like, and a lot of people, if you play keyboard, for example, you might have a good MIDI keyboard that you can record with.
Yeah.
And then you just send it to the engineer, and it's, you know, MIDI data is just the performance data, right? So it sends that over, and then they can assign whatever instrument that they have to it in the DAW.
Right.
Which works pretty smoothly from my experience.
Right. Yeah. Sometimes, I mean, accent or something will need, you know, corrected or something. But for the most part, it translates pretty well, right? And
and they can help you edit the data, right? Yeah. Right. Like you were saying.
Yeah.
But it's like otherwise, you know, the alternative is them watching you do the MIDI keyboard thing.
Right. And again, it goes into time where
fun.
like MIDI information is MIDI information, right? So if you take 3 hours to get that perfect piano take or a keyboard or a synthesizer or whatever, and then and same thing, I think, like, even if someone just had the stock Logic or, you know, whatever DAW, like MIDI piano or electric keyboard, I know for some folks I swap out virtual instruments for them. So, you know, I know we both have like small libraries of virtual instruments and our favorites and etc. So like sometimes like swapping their electric piano sound could just get something that's changes it and can get something maybe a little more realistic sounding or that matches the track better. And then again, if it's MIDI, even if it's whatever track, the engineer can usually work with that and you know, make that fit into the track. So MIDI is definitely like one.
You don't have to invest in this crazy expensive instrument library because the engineer probably has it.
Right, or maybe you have it and you can just bounce it and you can use that track and get it exactly how you want and just save that as an audio track and give that to them. So that's an easy one to kind of do at home. Yeah. We also said direct lines in might be one. So if you're doing a bass, for instance, or capturing a guitar track that you want reamped or something, I know for me...
And that's the thing I've realized, like, a lot of people don't know about reamping, right? Which is where you're, like, you know, obviously, but like, where you take the signal and you run it out to an amp and then they record the amp. And so you can have your performance recorded and comped and, you know, have the performance that you want, you know it's what you want, and then you run it through the amp and record it, so.
Right. And I find for bass, I mean, I think more so... Guitar, I think, often needs to be reamped to really sound, right? Like you can use virtual amp sims too, and they've gotten better. And certain ones like Kemper and things like that are in a different category. But with bass, I find I can often run it through my preamps, and I end up using that core sound and building from there. And so I think that also, like, if people want to record guitar at home and also capture the direct line, if they can get both, that's another way they can have different options later with an engineer and not invest a bunch of time and things, but capturing stuff as direct line.
They do have to get comfortable with that, you know, because I have like, there are people who it's like, oh, I don't want to figure this out and it's stressing me out, and can I just come in? And then that's fine. Like, that's fun. Absolutely, I like that too. Same thing with the MIDI, you know, sometimes it's too much. But if you are comfortable figuring it out, it's one of those things that doesn't take as much to figure out.
Right. Yeah, and again, like, if that's something that the artist wants because it's going to get them a different take or an inspiration, or they're going to get to use a different virtual instrument that's going to inspire them, then that's a reason to do that. It's more like, if you want a cost saving, this is a potential area. Right? So like,
for sure.
Yeah, and I think even like direct in could be a keyboard or something too. If they have a keyboard or synthesizer sound they like, they can just capture that in their interface, and that can often be used without a lot of fancy equipment. And so, and then, you know, engineers can run it through plugins or even outboard gear to get more analog saturation and things like that if you want. So there's ways to get around that without having to,
to improve it.
We said that potentially electric guitars could be one that can be recorded at home, like, fairly easily. It depends on the technique and everything, but you know, for the most part, you can get a microphone pretty close to a guitar amp and get that direct sound. And there's things that are nice in a studio, like capturing a room sound or getting microphone further back that are nice for electric guitars, but you can really, just put it up on the grill and get a sound that you
like
want.
It's
if
loud
you want.
enough that,
Yeah. So it drowns out a lot of the room sound if you're using a condenser or a dynamic mic like a SM57 is a classic, right? But there's other mics like I'm thinking of like the Sennheiser E906 or something that are just made to be right there. So you can goes back to that sound. You could get a simple preamp and you could have your sound that you dial in, and so you have your go-to preamp, and then you just flip it on, and the signals levels are set, and you get a good sound like that, and you can integrate that into your other sounds. So
for sure.
Yeah, and the last one we said was in terms of things that you might record at home, or suggestions might be supporting vocals. Vocals in general are really nice at the studio, but if it's something where it's not prominent and maybe like you're like going to layer a bunch of stuff or something,
because those like usually we filter them anyway sometimes, or whatever, it depends on the genre, but like a lot of times those don't need to be as solid in terms of the recording quality. So
take the time with your takes or something with that, and I often recommend to people, if they're really new to the home recording and that kind of stuff, like people always think you need a condenser mic, but if people don't have a good room, it's just like just use, if you have an SM57 that you sing on stage with, that really will probably get you a better result. Like,
it's like that, if it's not broke, don't fix it type of thing. So, if you like that sound and it works for your music, just use that. You don't have to use the
and especially stuff that's going to be kind of tucked in and further back and stuff like that.
Well, the other thing I see sometimes with beginners is like the idea of, I should get a condenser mic, and then they get like a really cheap one, and like those sound so bad. Like $100 condenser. Well, there are some decent $100 condensers. But you know what I mean? Like if you compare it to an affordable dynamic mic, a really cheap condenser mic it might pick up all the wrong stuff. In addition to your room not being ideal. And then it's like you're causing more trouble for yourself.
Exactly.
You probably just want to replace it anyway at some point. And,
When people are newer to the stuff, I so often recommend like a SM57 or 58 just to and use that for recording too, because and then you end up your EQ, you're trying to figure out as an engineer, then we're trying to figure out like what do we cut from this, because there's so many resonances and there's so many like room artifacts, and it's just like it's really like a kind of a balance, right, of like how much do we cut into this track to try and make it sound professional versus like it's just hard to make it sound good when the foundation isn't good, and again it's not about the take or the artist, it's about the actual technical recording,
the equipment. For sure. So like with a 57 or 58, like if you recommend the 58, if they then outgrow that at some point, they can still use that. Like that's still a good mic to have around. They can use it for like gigs. They can use it, so it's a good thing that I've thought about this with a lot of my studio equipment too. It's like, what happens when I outgrow that? Or I want to upgrade. Like, is it still going to be useful to me? Or is it going to be something that I just spent money on and now it's gone and I don't use it anymore? And like a 58 is really good for that type of mindset.
Because you don't outgrow them, and you can always use them for something. So whereas you might want to keep upgrading your condenser mic or something like that, and you then at some point you realize that if you don't have a good space to record it in, that's really the problem more than the condenser, right? Like I mean, the same thing like we talked about like earlier, like if you have a $3,000 U87 in a bad room, I would probably take a much cheaper mic in a better room, because the results are going to be better, even if the fidelity and the magic sauce in the mic is not the same. What it's picking up is going to be better. It's going to yield a better result, right? So,
exactly. But it's like, every studio has a 58 for a reason.
Right. So we talked a lot about things that we suggest recording at home. So let's talk about some of our suggestions recording it at the studio. So one of ours was lead or important vocals, assuming that the vibe of the studio and that you feel comfortable. But that's one that you really want to have if you can, like the best performance, highest fidelity. Right?
I think that's a good one. Because it's also like that's what a lot of music listeners, that's what they attach to first. Like that's one of the things that grabs people emotionally, is hearing that human voice. So if you dial that in more carefully, that can have a really big impact on a song.
Right. So our second group of instruments is what we just kind of called acoustic instruments. So this goes back to room treatment and space and stuff like that. If you have something that you really want to capture the ambiance of and you want to be a little further back from it, acoustic instruments can be nice to capture in a studio.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think like the big ones that all go into a commercial. I've mentioned this already, but like the idea of going in for like a grand piano or drum kit recording, right? Because a lot of what I like to do with that is get that sense of space and get that like character and texture and stuff, and like that can be really hard to get if you don't have a ton of space and it doesn't sound beautiful. So you know, and like that's half the fun is like I like drums with, for example, with a lot of the room in them. Like I like that.
Yeah, I do too. I like experimenting with drum mics and smashing with compressors and you know all that kind of stuff like that. So
well, then you get a little overwhelming at points and then bring it back. Yeah.
And that's where a really nice tuned room with great acoustics. That's where you can really, you know, that's a separation there, right? And same with like a grand piano sound. You can get the piano up close. You can get it in the room, and it really has it does bring life to it.
It has this like if you get a good recording like that, it can have this feeling like, you know, like when you're sitting at a fire pit and there's something that's similar in my mind to that. Yeah.
It's like a feeling that comes around you or something, just like
it's like the analog crackle too. You know, like there's something
the magic that's always so hard to explain with analog.
There's something there that I really like, I think.
But. And our other one, we said drums are important. We just brought that up. Drums were an important one. And then the other thing we said, which came up a little bit, was if the studio has inspiring house instruments. So we kind of labeled house instruments. So an example would be a grand piano, right? Because that's not something that most of us have access to at home studios. But another one might be something that is smaller. Maybe it's a collection of guitar pedals. Maybe it's a Wurlitzer piano that they keep in good shape or something. Or maybe it's just something that the studio has that's available to you that you wouldn't normally have access to. Right. So. And
that can extend to like gear too, you know. Like, you know, big plate reverbs. And, you know, things that you wouldn't be able to. But yeah, a lot of studios have, especially the really big ones, they have like these massive collections of stuff that you can tinker with. And that includes instruments and equipment and.
Right. So it's fun to go in and play things that you don't normally get access to. Again, it can spark ideas. So, you know, and our point really is not about that you shouldn't be prepared for the studio. It's that it's to get what you want out of it, right? It's to like have a plan and feel like you, for the money and time you invested, you got the result that you want or the experience that you wanted. So, you know, by all means, if you want to go in and the studio has a keyboard collection and you want to just spend 8 hours experimenting and writing songs and whatever, like, then that's, you know, if that's your intended purpose, that's great, you know, or like.
I've had people like book sessions to record piano and they're just trying to get little samples to use. Oh, you know, so they're like just, you know, it seems like they're tinkering around, but they're just, they're there for samples, not for like one cohesive thing. And I think that's great. I think that's fun.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's fun. I've had experiences where I've gone into a studio and something will happen and take a left turn because of a sound that came out of one of the house instruments or, you know, just the ability to have it sound great or there's character or something that really lends to your track. So I've had a really good experience with that, just playing the instruments that are in studios. And sometimes it's not even about that they have expensive ones, which they do sometimes, but sometimes it's about something with character.
Yeah, something interesting.
Yeah, something interesting.
Like
yeah, exactly.
Vintage or, all that stuff. Yeah. And like part of that's, you know, there's like the going in with a goal thing, but then there's also this other like facet of it that you can either take or leave, but there's this, when you go into a studio like that, there's this opportunity to like learn and grow, right? Because it can be like, oh, I want to try this one piece of equipment on this song. And then it's like, you're getting that experience of getting to know that piece of equipment. And a lot of times, like for me, a lot of my experience in studios and working in studios has helped me decide like what emulations I want to get or like what, you know, so that can, that's like an added benefit to it.
Yeah. You just understand that stuff a little bit better and you can make choices based on that. Right. So like, you're matching the sound you want, the results you want to the equipment that's going to help you get there. Yeah.
You get this like better understanding of what you want and then you can communicate it better next time too.
Exactly.
Which is kind of cool. Okay. And that's it. That's the whole conversation. I hope you liked it. Let me know what you think in the comments below. As always, like, comment, subscribe, check out the Patreon. The Patreon is patreon.com/Cato Noise, and my patrons get access to some additional content that's on my website. For example, we have a Discord server we're all hanging out on too. We are running a book club on the Discord server. It's a small group of us, but we've been having a lot of fun with it. And other than that, we're just, nerding out on the server. So, sharing free plugins and plugins that we like and sharing mixes and stuff like that. It's whatever tends to pop up. And there are also early release videos for my Patreon patrons like this one. So check that out if you feel so inclined. And other than that, I come out with new videos every Wednesday. And thank you so much for hanging out. Okay.
Do this kind of hybrid stuff more. Does that feel?
Yeah,
like a
that feels
start?
good. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Should I WD-40 my turn?
Okay.
You're going out of the frame.
All right, I'm coming back.
Yeah, come back.
All right.
Yeah.
Do we want to do any kind of like closing thoughts or anything that didn't come up in the first thing?
Yeah, I don't know what I would say.
Yeah.